build a particle system using sound particles. What I did is I collected a bunch of medieval sound effects. These are all from Soundly. We'll place them in sound particles, creating this field of battle. So we're starting with an empty project. We could go to the battlefield and customize it, but just to kind of go through the steps of building the system, I think it'd be better to start with empty. And we're going to go to the mic system, and we're going to make this a Atmos. If we were working at school and using the 5.1 system, we would just build 5.1, but Atmos will actually sound a lot cooler. And we're going to make sure that we're using the binaural output. Okay, so we have a mic system, and we're set up for binaural listening. When you're not looking at this window here, you could know that you're in binaural mode by these little headphones that are here. You'll notice when I turn this on and off, the icon appears and disappears. So when you see the headphones, you know you're listening binaurally. Also, don't forget to go into project settings and make sure you check include original audio files. This will embed them in the project file, and it just makes it easier to keep all your files together. Now let's add a new particle group. Okay, so you see as soon as I add the particle group, we have this group of dots arranged around the microphone. That's because the default is torus, which is a circle. If I go to the perspective view, now I'm going to hold down the option key so I can pan around. We'll see it's this circle, and they're not all on the same plane. They're slightly varied up and down. So we have the particle group. Now we're going to add some sounds to it. What essentially is happening here is when we add the sounds, it's going to distribute the sounds amongst all these different particles here. And right now the particle amount is 100. Let's make it 25. You'll see it's significantly less. If we counted them, it would be 25. Okay, and we're going to add some sounds. So now if I add 5 sounds, it's going to randomly place those 5 sounds all around in this group of 100. If I add 50 sounds, it'll randomly place those 50 sounds. Let's see what we're going to start with. We'll just start with the main sword fight. Just a bunch of varied sword impacts. And again, these are all from Soundly, so a really great option for our sound library. You'll generally get this because a lot of times the samples you bring in, or the sounds you bring in, aren't necessarily at 48K. If that's what your project is set up at, that's okay, it'll just convert them. So now we have, let's see, how many sounds? We have 73 sounds that are going to be distributed over 100 particles that are in a circle around us. That's basically what is happening right now. If we take a look down here, these are the properties for the particle system. So the start time is 0 seconds. If I delayed this, so right now you'll see 3 seconds in, the particle system appears. The start zone is the type of shape of our particle system. So right now it's a torus, which is like this circle or ring. We go to box, it's a box. If you notice, if I pan around, it's actually not a flat rectangle, it's a box. If I go to rectangle, you'll see it's pretty much a flat rectangle. So it's not distributed up and down. We can choose a circle, and it's kind of like a torus, but it's a little bit more uniform, you can see, compared to the torus. And a sphere, back to torus. So the other properties are the center, and this is just really where it exists in relation to the microphone. So you can control the X value for the center, so that's moving it left or right. Y is front back, and Z is up down. Let's put these back to 0. The main radius is how far it is from the center. The section radius is kind of how dispersed they are. You can see as it's still retaining the torus shape, but the particles are more separated. So this is 52 feet from the middle, and the section radius it's like a 17-foot dispersion from kind of that center ring. We're just going to kind of leave these settings how I had it here, and I'm going to render it. Let's see what we get. 73 swords all hitting at one time. That's not what we want for our battle. We want all of these to be distributed over time. And that's where we get down to the audio modifiers. If I click on this plus sign, you'll see there's 5 different audio modifiers we can use. We're going to go to delay and start with that one. And this is random delays. So this randomly will delay when these particles are born, to use the language from video particle systems. So if we delay when they're created, they won't all happen at the same time. They'll happen at different times. So the default is randomized at 2 seconds. So if I render that, you'll hear it's not really gonna do much because it does it all over 2 seconds. However, we can change this value right down here, the maximum delay. And this really depends on how long you need for your battle. So if we want 45 seconds for the battle, render it. Okay, so pretty good, but because we're stretching it over 45 seconds, we need to increase the amount of particles we're creating, because 100 stretch over 45 seconds is going to make them pretty sparse. And we want a more dense battle, so I'm going to up this to 500. So if I scroll through, you'll see we'll have some more particles going. You might want to even go higher, but let's see what this sounds like. Okay, let's see what 1,000 sounds like. Quantity-wise, I think we'll go with that, because it's not 1,000 being occurring at one time, it's 1,000 over 45 seconds. However, they're all happening at different times, but we also want some other variation introduced because we're still only dealing with 73 sounds and we want them all to sound a little bit different at different times. So we're going to try some of these other audio modifiers. We're going to start with time and pitch. What this is going to do is it creates these particles over time. It's going to randomly vary the pitch of each of them. The default is 12 semitones, which is pretty high and pretty low and will sound pretty weird if we're reproducing the swords 12 semitones lower. That's like a whole octave down. So we're just going to change this to plus minus 5 semitones. So I'm going to render this. Press play. So that's just going to make all the swords sound a little more varied. The other audio modifier we're going to apply is going to be gain, because now they are still all playing at the same level. We also want some randomization in the gain. Remember, this whole idea of a particle system is to simulate the real world where nothing is uniform and perfect every time. There's always little variations, and that's what we're simulating with this. So we'll do randomized gain. This defaults to 12 dB, so that means the lowest one is going to be 12 dB and the highest one is going to be at whatever level they're at now. I think we'll leave it at that. So right now, just to reiterate what's going on, as it creates these particles, it's going to randomly vary the gain of each one, so they won't all be at the same level. It's going to randomly vary the delay when they actually are born, so that's why it stretches it over the whole 45 seconds that we set for it. And it's going to randomize the pitch slightly of each one, so we're just not repeating 73 sounds. It's a little bit different each time. So let's see what we have now. Okay, cool. So I think we have a good selection of swords appearing. Let's look back at the particle system shape. I just started with Taurus because that was the default, but let's try something different. Let's try the rectangle. So that puts us now in the middle of the battle more. Because we were in a Taurus, it was kind of all around us, and it wasn't like right next to us, but we're in the middle of the battle. It's going to be right there. So we have our rectangle, and the width of the rectangle is 32 feet. So if we take a look right here, this perimeter is going to be about 32 feet. We're going to widen it because battles are generally a little wider than that. Let's go to 500 feet. Okay, now that's just the width. Now we're also going to make the depth 500 as well, giving us a square. So now the particles are going to appear in a 500 by 500 field around us. Some really close, some far. Let's render it, see what it sounds like. I'm going to increase the amount of particles. I feel like I want a denser battle than that. Okay, cool. And so the other thing we want to think about is what plane these are on. So these particles are all occurring on the same plane as the microphone. So basically at the same height as the microphone. And I guess that kind of makes sense. We can, however, change this to a box. So now, difference between a rectangle and a box. A box is going to have, it's not all going to be on the same plane. It's going to have some height. There'll be some higher and some lower. So right now this box, I'm going to again do 500 by 500. And we'll also have a height. So now it's 16 feet. And I don't think we want our swords happening varied 16 feet up and down. It's, I mean, just a smaller, there'll be some people that are 5 feet tall and some people that are like 6'8". So that's like maybe a 2-foot variation. So we're just going to make this 2 feet. So right now it's 500 width, 500 depth, and height, the variation is going to be just 2 feet, just to have some difference. So let's see what this sounds like. Oops, oh, it's glitching. It's glitching because I didn't render it first. Because we're using the Atmos microphone, which is 9 plus 1 channels that it's rendering, and we have 2,000 particles. It's always good to render, at least render it ahead a little bit like this. And now we'll push play. And I'm going to name this swords. So if I select the group, scroll up here, you'll see the name. You can name it swords. Okay, so now we're going to bring in another element, and we can duplicate this if we'd like, and I think I will, just to move a little more quickly. I can create an empty particle system and just start it all over, but since the battlefield is going to essentially be the same as we add these elements, I'm just going to duplicate what we have and alter it from there. First, I'm going to delete all the sounds that are in this particle system. Okay, and we're going to do feet now. Name this feet. Okay, so we do need to make a couple of changes to this. Notice, by the way, I can shut off the swords particles by just muting it so we don't see it. Okay, so feet occur on the ground, always on the same plane. So we don't want to use a box, we want to use a rectangle for this. And we'll do 500 by 500. And we just want to place this below us. So I'm going to go to the Z. And again, Z brings it up and down. And I'm just going to make it -6 feet down. Let's see what this looks like. So let's see what this sounds like with the other parameters all the same as the swords. Because the parameters are the same doesn't mean that they're all going to happen at the same time. In other words, you're not going to hear a footstep at the exact time as the sword because it's really randomized. It's not always going to be precisely the same, which is kind of the beauty of a particle system. So let's see what we have. Hit render. I think what I want to do is I want to listen to the randomization of the pitch. Let's make this 2 semitones. Sounded like some of the feet just were a little too low. I'm going to bring in the swords. All right, I think that's sounding pretty good. It's really dense sounding. I'm hearing some good variation of all the elements. So now we're going to add in some voices. I'm going to duplicate the sword track again. We'll call this voices. And I think I'm going to limit the amount of particles to 100 to start with. And oops, you can shut autoplay off. It scares me sometimes when I click on it and then suddenly hear a person being impaled by a sword. So I'm going to select all these. You can just do Command A. That'll select them all. Delete. So I'm deleting it from the voices track to human. You notice it varies, which is nice. Every time you create a new system or track, it changes the color, which is really nice because you can see where the particles are happening. So now if I scroll through, we can look at this. We'll see the voices are not, they're not like as prevalent as the swords, because you can imagine it's not going to be a lot of grunting. Yeah, there will be a lot of grunting and grunting, but probably more swords than grunts and grunts. It's not like every time you swing a sword, you grunt, right? Maybe you do. I don't know. Anyway, let's see what it sounds like. Let's move on to another element. So let's say there are arrows flying around. So we're going to duplicate the swords track again. Arrow, and I have impacts and I have whooshes. And so let's go with impacts. Arrow impacts. By the way, to move these tracks up and down in the order, you can't actually drag them. You have to use the command, which is okay. Just right click on it and change it. We don't want, I don't think, as many arrow impacts. Let's lower this. Let's try 200 on this. Okay, and we're going to make this maybe a little lower. Let's do it minus 2 feet, assuming it's going to be hitting at people's chests. And we're assuming 0 is where our head is. All right, let's hear what it sounds like with everything in. Let's add another element. We'll add the arrows flying above us. We'll go to swords and we will duplicate again. Arrow, whoosh, leap. As you add elements, your computer will get a little more sluggish in doing things. 200 particles. We want it to be happening above us. So I'm gonna go to the Z. You'll notice, by the way, you can type in a number here. You can use this slider, or you can hover over this. And this is actually for fine adjustments. I find the slider sometimes is too fast and it just zips to a really high number. And if you want like a more controlled amount, I would just hover over the parameter or type it in. I'm just going to make these like 10 feet above us. Okay, I think we need to hear this with everything. So the other thing we want to add to this is some horses. So once again, I'm going to duplicate the swords track. And with horses, definitely have less of these. We'll do 100 horses. And this is a variation of neighs and trotting and galloping. I'm going to mute everything else. And I'm also going to try some movement on these guys, because right now they're, horses, especially the galloping ones, aren't going to be stationary. They're going to be moving. So for that, we're going to go to movement modifiers. We'll go to rotational movement. Let's try this. So see what's happening? Right now, it's kind of like the horses are going around us. Let's hear what it sounds like with everything. So we built up our battle. We can mix it if we want. You just kind of mix from up here if we want to adjust the levels of any given sound. This is also where you would change the color if you want to change the color of a particular track. One of the problems that can occur is When you do this, you just have so many elements, it starts sounding a little mushy, and then you have to go in and adjust the volume as well as maybe the particles for each element. Sometimes you can also adjust the parameters for whatever particle shape you have. We're happy with what we have, and we want to export it. File, export, export audio, and you would choose interleaved unless if you wanted each channel separately, the left, center, right, blah, blah, blah. But we're going to do this as one track, wave 24-bit. So if I go back to this folder, Battle Demo Waves here, we open it in QuickTime Player just to look at what we have. You'll see 10 channels. Those are the 9.1 Dolby Atmos channels. If for some reason you decided that you needed to export this as 5.1, it's relatively easy. You can just mute this mic system, create a new mic system, and let's change this to the multi-channel speakers. We're choosing 5.1, okay. You'd have to render it, but then you would export the 5.1 file. However, if you're exporting this to mix in Pro Tools, let's say, what you'd want to do is export stems. So you would mute all the channels except the one stem you want to create. So let's say we want to create the foot stem, you'd export that. Then you would export the voice stem, horse stem, and so on. So that way you would have 6 separate stems that are all 5.1 or Atmos, whatever you choose to export as, that you could bring into Pro Tools and mix all those elements separately. It would be nice in the mix to have some flexibility in balancing all of them.